Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you've been enjoying all the talks yesterday and today as well. My talk is called Math on Trial. I wrote a book with the same title with my mum, which, by the way, is not something I really recommend doing, but we both came out of it alive. So the book is about how math has been used in the past as evidence during criminal trials, so mostly statistics and probability, and specifically the mistakes that have been made. I'll touch on a few of the stories in the talk, but we'll go a little bit further and just think about how math, could or can be used during trials, and whether it should be at all. I mean, I think you probably know my position on this, but it's a question that's quite big at the moment. So we'll start with a tiny bit of revision, because I know that people are always very worried that they won't understand the math. So we're going to start very slowly with the multiplication rules for probabilities. So if you have two events and you want to find the probability that they are both happening, then you just take the individual probabilities and multiply them. This has one very, very important condition, which is that the events have to be independent. So this is something that's, if you're a student and doing your exams and you have, a coin that you toss twice, then obviously the two tosses are independent. But in real life, it's actually a lot more difficult to find out if things are independent or not. So I've got a couple of interesting examples. For example, the first one is the gender of your children. So say you've had 3 boys, and you're pregnant again, or your partner's pregnant. Does the fact that you've had 3 boys affect the probability of whether your next child will be a boy or a girl? What do you guys think? It doesn't. So you're right, it doesn't. I mean, there are some slight subtleties. It looks like maybe there are actually more all-boy families than you would expect in the UK. There's also things that affect it, like the fact that people quite want to have children of both sexes. So if you have 2 children, a boy and a girl, people tend to stop at that point. But if you have 2 boys, people don't want to be stuck with only boys, so they always try again. So that might affect the probabilities. So it's a little bit more complicated than you would think. The other one is being an American football player and committing suicide. So it seems like these two would be, why would they be related? But actually, it looks like they are related. There's a theory that it's because American football players, they get their head banged around a lot, and it actually damages their brain and makes them depressed. So something to think about for any sportsman. But yeah, so basically in real life, it's very, very hard actually to know when things are independent. And this rule that we all learn at school can only be used in independent cases. So that's very important to remember. And, well, it's been forgotten in the past for very disastrous results. So the first case that we're going to go through is the story of Sally Clark. So this was in the UK, and quite recently, in the beginning of the years 2000. Sally was a lawyer. Her husband was also a lawyer. They lived just outside of London, and they had 2 children die of sudden infant death syndrome, or cot death. And Sally was accused of having killed them both. At her trial, the expert witness was a man called Roy Meadow. In fact, Sir Roy Meadow. So he was an expert in child abuse and in cot death. And he was a very prominent figure at the time. In fact, he was the expert witness at countless trials of mothers whose children had died suddenly. And what he said was that he was going to, express the probability that those 2 cot deaths had just happened randomly. And the way he did that is he looked at a very famous and well-regarded study that showed that in a family like Sally's, the probability of one cot death happening was about 1 in 8,500. When I say a family like Sally's, what I mean is that neither of the parents were smokers, they were quite wealthy, so that meant that a cot death was actually quite a very rare occurrence. And then he thought, well, the probability of 2 cot deaths happening, well, I'll just square this number, and I'll get very, very tiny probability, 1 in 73 million. So he said, that's just a tiny probability. If 2 cot deaths occur naturally in such a family 1 in 73 million times, you wouldn't see any for hundreds of years. So this can't have just happened just naturally, so she must have killed them. And on the strength of his argument, Sally was put in prison. She appealed, she lost her appeal, and it looked like it was all maybe going to die down and she was just going to stay in prison for her whole life. But people who had been following the case, just general members of the public and also her husband, realized that something very, very wrong had happened, and they got together and fought very hard. And then suddenly, it started being a bigger story in the country, and lots of other people started getting involved, and in particular the Royal Statistical Society released an open letter explaining exactly why the math was wrong. So in this case, obviously, when he squared the probability of 1 cot death, he was assuming that cot deaths are independent from each other, which we don't know, and in fact we have pretty good evidence to the contrary. Obviously, maybe there might be a genetic predisposition for this to happen. There's also the fact that a cot death isn't just one type of illness or anything. I mean, it just means a very small child has died, and we don't know what of. So her 2 children could have died of different things. But because we hadn't found the cause in either of the case, they were both classified as cot deaths. So he definitely shouldn't have squared the probability to find the probability of the 2 deaths. And this actually became quite a big deal, and Sally was released. It was very sad for Sally because she was just too traumatized by her stay in prison, and she never really recovered, and she died 4 years later, an alcoholic. It did mean that for other mothers who had been put in prison based on the strength of Sir Roy Meadows' testimony, it was much easier to then appeal, and a lot of them were freed quite quickly after that. One of the important things to remember from this very sad story is something that the RSS mentioned in their statement. They said statistics is it's an area of expertise, just like you would ask a doctor to be an expert witness in anything related to medicine, and you would ask, you would always go to the actual expert. And if you're dealing with statistics, well, you have to ask a statistical expert. You can't just have some random person who thinks they know what they're talking about, just standing on the stand. And, Roy Meadows was an expert in child abuse, but he was not an expert in statistics. It's a very, very difficult field. So, this is a very important thing to realize. The next story is a bit more light. So this is a very interesting case which happened in LA in 1968. It seems like a very, very just small story at first, but it had very, very important repercussions. So what happened is that an old woman was walking along the street, and she was suddenly pushed violently from behind. And she looked up, and she saw a young blonde woman with a ponytail running away from her with her bag. And the blonde woman burst out of it was a little alleyway, burst out of the street. And at the end of the street, there was a man standing in his garden who saw her, run out and jump into a yellow car that was waiting for her. And he saw the driver very clearly. It was a black man with a mustache and a beard. So together, the man, who was called John, and the old woman, Juanita, they went to the police, and they described this couple. And at the time, interracial couples were very rare. And the policeman thought, oh, well, I'll ask around if anyone knows of anyone who fits this description. and then I'll find them, and then they will be the right one, because, you know, if they fit the description, it's so rare that they must be the right one. So that's exactly what he did. He went around and he asked for, you know, interracial couples with a yellow car, and he found one, which were the Collins, Malcolm and Janet. And he brought them in for questioning, and it was actually all a bit harder than he thought, because they didn't have an alibi, but there was no way of disproving their alibi either. And also, there were various issues. People remembered, you know, Janet's hair color as being darker or lighter than it was, and also Malcolm didn't have a beard and a mustache. So they had to try to prove that he had on the day of the robbery, and it was all very, very complicated. But still, he felt that he had enough information to actually prosecute them. And the prosecutor agreed with him, so he agreed intuitively. It seemed, okay, this is such a, you know, specific description. If we found the couple that matches the description, then they must be the right one. But the trial wasn't going very well for him at all. And so he thought, okay, I'll just try to explain this intuition I have in a mathematical way. So, you know, he also had this very big impassioned speech. It was actually quite interesting, the speech. It was about how, you know, proof beyond reasonable doubt was a very outdated thing, and you had to think about the probability. And anyway, so what he did to translate this intuition he had was he made a list of the characteristics that described the couple with associated probabilities. So these are the characteristics he chose: a black man with a beard, a man with a mustache, a white woman with blonde hair, a woman with a ponytail, an interracial couple in a car, and a yellow car. And if you're interested in knowing how he found these probabilities, he just, you know, took them out of his own head. He actually, he asked his secretaries also for their opinions. So then he multiplied all of them, found 1 in 12 million, said, you know, this is a tiny, tiny probability. There can't be 2 such couples in the area, so this must be the right one. So obviously, apart from the fact that the probabilities are all completely wrong, he also multiplied all these probabilities together when pretty clearly there are, you know, they're not all independent from each other. So, for example, I don't know if anyone wants to tell me 2 that you don't think are independent. Beard and mustache. Okay. When I'm doing this talk for teenagers, I always have very handy pictures of people with beards and mustaches, but I cut them from you, but maybe that would happen. So yes, obviously this was all completely wrong. He did get them convicted though, so they were both convicted. Janet only had a 1-year conviction, and she decided to just stay out of it, you know, do her 1 year and then leave. But Malcolm, who had a previous conviction, he had this time he had a much longer sentence, and so he appealed. And something very interesting happened at the appeal. Oh, I should say first of all that the defense lawyer, he did somehow sense that this wasn't right, that these probabilities weren't all independent, but he went about explaining that in a way that wasn't so convincing. So I'll just give you an example of what he said here. Apologies for the language. Obviously, this is him. So yeah. So this didn't really help his case. But what did help the case is that when Malcolm appealed, his appeal brief fell into the hands of a man called Lawrence Tribe, who was very young at the time, just in his 20s. He's now a very, very famous person in America. He's a lawyer. He works for Obama. He defended Al Gore in front of the Supreme Court. He's just a very prominent figure. At the time, he was only in his 20s, studying for a law degree, but he had done an undergraduate in mathematics at Harvard. And he saw immediately that, what had been done was completely wrong. He wrote a very, very good refutal of it, and Malcolm was released. I think it was still 4 years later, so 4 years in prison for this. And something that Lawrence Tribe wrote just a few years later, maybe 5 years later, he wrote this very seminal paper on using mass at trial. So he had seen a few of these cases where it just didn't work out. The people who did the mass didn't know what they were doing. The people who were listening to the mass had no idea what was happening either. And it was just all a big mess. And he actually came to the conclusion that mass shouldn't be used at trials. So he said, it threatens to make the legal system seem even more alien and inhuman than it already does to distressingly many. He just felt that, how cold and precise math was, just went against what a jury was supposed to be, which was to be human beings with intuition and feelings and understanding other human beings. So he just thought that it shouldn't exist anymore. And effectively, he halted the use of mass at trial for a very long time because he was such a prominent figure. But then what happened is that DNA analysis came on the scene, and you just cannot have DNA analysis without having probability figures. So I'm going to go through now a more recent case, which is about DNA analysis and how the mass was used in that one. This is the case of Diana Sylvester. So this was once again in the 60s or 70s in San Francisco. She was a young nurse, and I'm sorry, this is always very difficult. These really horrible stories, but she was raped and murdered in her flat, and her landlady saw the man coming out. She was very scared, obviously, so she was hiding in her own flat, but she did see him come out. She described him to the police, and they searched the area, but they didn't find anything that was conclusive at all, so they had to close the case. And then 30 years later, the San Francisco Police Department received a grant to reopen cold cases that had DNA in their files, which this case did have. And what they were doing with these cold cases, they were taking the DNA samples and running them through the database of offenders. So in this case, it was a database of sex offenders, and seeing if they got a hit, which is called a cold hit. And they did find someone. So they found a guy called John Puckett, and he was found in their database of sex offenders, which was 338,000 people. So one thing to understand about DNA samples, is that they all come with a probability called the RMP, the random match probability, which is the probability that a person picked at random off the street would match the DNA sample that you have. And if you have a perfect DNA sample, so this is what an electropherogram looks like, which is the drawing of a DNA sample, basically. It has these pairs of peaks, and if you have a really good one, the rest is all very flat. If you have quite a bad one, there might be a lot of noise. Or you might have, sometimes you have mixed samples, so you have more pairs of peaks than you would like. The pairs represent genes, the genes that scientists have decided are the best ones to focus on to differentiate from one person to the next. And if two people match on every single pair of peaks, then they're the same person or identical twins. If you have even one peak different, then you cannot be the same. It cannot be from the same person. But there's a big problem that happens in old samples, for example, which is that you won't have all the 13 pairs of peaks that you want to have to get a complete profile. So in Puckett's case, there were only five of them, 5 and maybe half of one, out of the 13. So that means that the random match probability, so the probability that a random person would match his profile, was actually pretty high. It was 1 in 1.1 million, which sounds like a tiny number, but obviously if you think about how many people there are in the world, that means that a lot of people would actually match his sample. And his defense lawyer, who is called Bicka Barlow, she... first of all, the first thing was that she was very worried about how the RMPs had been calculated. These, by the way, are done by the FBI. They are figures given by the FBI. And she thought that they might be really, really wrong because she had seen evidence that seemed to completely contradict the numbers that had been found. So what she had seen was this study done I can't remember, in some state, I think it was Arizona, where they had a database, I think it was of prisoners, and someone had decided, oh, that's interesting, I'll just see if I can find any people who match, whose DNA profiles match. And they had found 9 loci match, RMP of 1 in 13 billion, so really pretty tiny probability, and they had found quite a lot of matches. So Barlow thought that maybe the RMPs were just completely wrong. She wrote this in this was a very strange trial. Both the defense and the prosecution didn't want a lot of information to be given to the jury because they thought it would hurt their case. So for example, they didn't want the jury to know it was a cold hit. They didn't want to know about the probabilities because it would be too confusing or anything like that. So most of the trial was actually done by briefs, and then the judge would read the briefs, and a lot of it didn't actually get shown to the jury. But anyway, so she thought that this seemed very strange given the tiny RMP, and she thought the RMPs were wrong. Actually, she was making a very common mistake, which is best explained when we think about the birthday problem. So I'm sure most of you will have heard of the birthday problem. It asks how many people do you need in a room to reach a chance of at least 50% that 2 of them share a birthday. Does anyone know the answer? Of course, you all know the answer. So this is surprisingly low. And it comes from the fact that you're not asking anyone to share, to have a specific birthday. You're not saying who has birthday on the 1st of January. You're saying 2 people can share any birthday. And the reason the number is lower than you think is that actually when you're looking at 23 people, you have a lot of pairs of people. So you can match 1 and 2 or 1 and 3, and the number of pairs goes up very, very high. So that's exactly what the mistake that she was making when she was considering the number of matches, of DNA matches. She wasn't considering the fact that they could match on anything, or any nine loci or anything. So actually, if you calculate the expected number, it's incredibly close to what they did find. So the RMPs are actually very, very clear and very very precise, and there's nothing wrong with them. So then she thought, okay, they're right, but still, 1 in 1 million is quite a small number, and especially when you consider it compared to the size of the database. So the database that Puckett had been found in was 338,000 people, and if you have an RMP of 1.1 million, she was saying, look, there was a 1 in 3 chance that you would find someone in the database who would match their profile. So, this doesn't really have any, this isn't actually a very strong thing at all, this match. And, first of all, this is right. There was a 1 in 3 chance of finding someone in the database who matched the DNA profile, but that doesn't then tell us if the person was, the right one or not. And then the prosecution had another, counter-argument, which was actually, very important, which was to say he matched on the DNA profile, with a fairly low RMP, but he also was the right age to have committed the crime at that time. They had pictures of him at the time of the murder. He looked exactly like the description. He fit the description perfectly. He was the right race. He lived in the right place. So the important probability is to think, is the probability of all of these things happening at the same time. I don't think there is an actual conclusion to this case, because I think Puckett died. He was very, very ill when they found him. But it's an interesting case where actually calculating the probability could have been very useful. So probability has to appear when you're talking about DNA. People are still making a lot of mistakes about it, but that's not the only problem. So the next case I'm going to talk about is a case where actually the math was done completely right. It's quite a recent case, but yet there were still issues. This is another one in England. It's quite recent, just a few years ago. What happened is that a woman who was called during the trial Miss M was coming back home quite late at night, and a man stopped her to ask for the time, and then raped her. And she had a look at her attacker, and she went to the police straight away. She described him. She said he had a local accent, he was Caucasian, he was in his early 20s. And they were able to get a very good DNA sample of the attacker. So it was very good, an European 1 in 200 million. So, really quite small. But that didn't help. I mean, the description wasn't very precise, and it didn't match anyone, the DNA didn't match anyone in their database. But then 2 years later, completely, related to a completely unconnected crime, a new profile popped up in the database of a man called Denis Adams, and this profile matched the DNA that they had found in the Miss M case. So they arrested Denis Adams, and they ran into a few problems. So the problems were that, first of all, he had an alibi for the night. His girlfriend provided an alibi. And secondly, he wasn't in his early 20s at all. He was in his late 30s. And in fact, Miss M hadn't recognized him in the lineup. She had even said, no, this man is much too old. So the DNA match, which is quite a small figure, very small probability, but then a lot of evidence against him being the right person. So it's quite hard to think of how these two compare to each other. People tend to think of DNA matches being quite absolute, and even if you're thinking about the RMPs and you see 1 in 200 million, that's a very small probability. So you might think, oh yeah, it must be him. But then there was some quite important thing against the guilty verdict as well. So what they did was they brought in a statistical expert, a real one this time, called Peter Donnelly, to come and try to explain the whole problem in terms of the probabilities. And he did it in a very, very thorough way. So first of all, the math he actually uses called Bayes' theorem. This is a little bit more complicated, but not that much more. So he gave everyone the formula. The probability of someone's guilt given the evidence is the probability of the guilt prior to evidence. So the probability of the guilt prior to evidence, if you start really at the beginning, is just 1 in 6 billion, because that's the number of people on the earth. But then you can maybe have it if you think, oh, he's a man, so okay, the guilt prior to evidence is 1 in 3 billion or whatever. And then times the likelihood ratio. And the likelihood ratio is where the evidence came in. So the probability of something happening if the person is actually guilty compared to the probability of something happening if the person is actually innocent. It will become clearer when I give the example. But what actually happened, which was really interesting, was that Peter Donnelly, instead of just doing everything himself, what he did is he gave everyone in the jury the formula, and he also gave them a questionnaire, a very detailed questionnaire, to help them understand what each of the probabilities were. So, for example, in the questionnaire there was something like, what do you think is the probability of the girlfriend giving an alibi even if he had actually done it? And when you break it down that way, every jury member were meant to enter their own probabilities. He also did his own calculation, just to show them how he would have done it, but he did encourage them completely to choose their own, to think of their own probabilities. So the ones that he chose were, so he chose for the prior probability the probability, the number of what he estimated as the number of local men, and then he multiplied it by 10 over 90. So he estimated that the probability of Miss M not recognizing him if he was actually guilty was about 10%, but obviously the probability of her not recognizing him if he was innocent was 90%. He did leave a little bit of a room of error. You might think that someone was the right person even if they weren't. And then for the alibi, he thought that, well, girlfriends are very likely to give their boyfriends an alibi even if they know they're guilty, so he said that was 25% that the girlfriend would give an alibi. And then he estimated 50% that the girlfriend would have given the alibi if he was innocent, just because it had happened 2 years prior. Maybe she wouldn't remember, so she wasn't 100% certain of giving it, even if he did have a correct alibi. So what he found, this is all the evidence without the DNA match, is a 1 in 3.6 million of him being guilty. Obviously, you would not convict anyone based on that. But then when you add the DNA evidence in, well, you get a 1 in 55 chance that Adams was innocent. That was Peter Donnelly's calculation. As I said, he let all the jury members make their own calculation. So then, obviously, it's up to you if you think that 1 in 55 is beyond reasonable doubt or not. There was also a big question about the actual RMP. The defense for Denis Adams were arguing that it was less than 200 million. It was more like 20 million, which would have changed this probability a lot. But what happened in the end is that the judge decided that this was all far too complicated, and that he would just overthrow all of the probability calculation, and that the jury would decide without considering the probability calculation. And they found Denis Adams guilty. I think he's appealing at the moment. So in fact, this is what was written in the judge's report. I'll read it out because it's quite long. More fundamentally, however, this is basically exactly the same thing as Lawrence Tribe said in his day. The mathematical formula applied to each separate piece of evidence is simply inappropriate to the jury's task. Juries evaluate evidence and reach a conclusion not only by means of a formula, mathematical or otherwise, but by the joint application of their individual common sense and knowledge of the world to the evidence before them. So he was saying, the formula is too complicated, and what people should do is use their common sense. And this was a really just a terrible judging for the whole using maths and using Bayes' theorem more particularly in court. And since then, there have been more of these. More judges have said basically exactly the same thing and have just completely disallowed probability reasoning in court. And I mean, obviously, saying that people should rely on their common sense rather than a mathematical formula just leaves room for so much error. I mean, our intuition is very often wrong. Our common sense is very, very often wrong. And if we can get the maths right, we should obviously use it. So it's clear that there are problems with that because people get confused by it, judges get confused by it. I remember when Donnelly was doing this explanation in this case, he was, giving all the jury and the judges, he gave them all calculators. He bought them all calculators and gave them all to them. And he ran them through an example, first of all, just to see if they were comfortable with using a calculator. And he said, at one point he reached the end and he was like, okay, so now your calculator should show the number 8 point blah, blah, blah. And the judge said, but mine shows 0. So there are some very big problems, even if you do all the maths right. There are some very big problems and questions to think about. But obviously, it's crazy to think that you should rely on common sense over math, and that math can't be incredibly, incredibly helpful with this type of question. We just need to find a way that will not confuse people and will not lead to all these errors, which a lot of people are working on at the moment. They're working on doing this. So yeah, that's it.